Forget everything the government-run schools have taught you about the pursuit of happiness. The founders had a far more radical understanding that something that most history lessons miss or just completely ignore, whether on purpose or not. So on this episode, we're going to unlock this important message from the Declaration of Independence the way the founders intended it. It's inextricably linked to individual, personal freedom and property rights, and not just physical property, but self-ownership. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, June 17th, 2024. Hope you had an awesome weekend, but let's get right to this. I want to kick it off here with a new article we just published by Mike Meharry, who's been churning out a lot of great stuff. We really appreciate his work. And Mike points out that the writings of John Locke heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson as he drafted the Declaration. In his second treatise on government, Locke listed life, liberty, and property as three fundamental natural rights. While Locke emphasized property as the third fundamental natural right, Mike writes, he also recognized that people naturally seek happiness, and governments should make every effort not to block the path to it. And here is the beginning of how we get to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think this is super interesting and important foundational stuff to understand what they were really talking about. And here from Locke, in an essay concerning human understanding, 1690, as therefore the highest perfection of intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness. You see that phrase coming together there already. He said, so the care of ourselves, that we mistake not imaginary for real happiness, is the necessary foundation of our liberty. So we're seeing this pursuit of individual happiness related to the pursuit and necessity of the foundation of liberty. Now, this was under a heading specifically titled The Necessity of Pursuing True Happiness, the Foundation of Liberty. And Meharry points out that Jefferson, John Dickinson, and many other, we're going to do a lot on Dickinson here today, and many other leading founders were heavily influenced by Locke, but other thinkers also influenced their worldview. And we also get some influence on going from life, liberty, property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from others like Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, who I've covered in regards to foreign policy. He was another natural rights philosopher who likely influenced Jefferson to change property to the broader idea of the pursuit of happiness. In his Principles of Natural Law, Burlamaqui identified the pursuit of happiness as the purpose of all human actions. So that was the whole point. People are naturally seeking advances to make their life better, to feel better about themselves, whatever that may be for each individual. In a follow-up work, The Principles of Natural and Politic Law, this was published after his death. All of his stuff is based on his lectures. And so they organized a bunch of his lectures into a follow-up book. Burlamaqui expounded on this and tied happiness to property. And he said this, natural liberty is the right which nature gives to all mankind. We have these rights because of the nature of our birth. So when we have a natural right of self-defense, we don't get that from a piece of paper. We don't get that through a permission slip. That is just, well, more of a population on its knees begging for scraps, as I generally put it on this show, than exercising our natural rights. So natural liberty, Burlamaqui put it, is the right which nature gives to all mankind of disposing of their persons and property after the manner they judge most convenient to their happiness. So this is, again, discussing happiness and light and rights on condition of their acting within the limits of the law of nature and of their not abusing it to the prejudice of other men. In other words, kind of a precursor to what many people might be familiar with, the NAP, the non-aggression principle. You can act and do what you want to do as long as you don't violate the rights of another person while doing that as well. That was from Burlamaqui. We can also see these principles in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which I'll get to in just a moment. But here's how this one is This is back to Locke. He said, nature, I confess, has put into man a desire of happiness and aversion to misery. These indeed are innate practical principles which do continue constantly to operate and influence all our actions without ceasing. These may be observed in all persons and all ages, steady and universal. So we're seeing this over and over and over. George Mason used it in the Declaration of Rights in Virginia, which was passed in June of 1776. That also influenced Jefferson's work on the Declaration. And here's how they put it in Section 1. All men, this sounds very familiar to the Declaration, of course, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And that brings me to John Dickinson, who in his 12th of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, published in 1767 and 1768, he wrote them all in late 1767, sent them over to James Otis Jr. and Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, said, hey, this is important stuff. I know you guys are leaders over there in Boston with the Sons of Liberty. You got to get the word out on these principles. And they certainly did. These were very widely read. I'll get to that in a moment. But Dickinson really tied all these together. You can see here in 1767 that he made this connection between happiness, freedom, and property all in one. He said, let these truths be indelibly impressed on our minds, that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property, that we cannot be secure in our property if, without our consent, others may, as by right, take it away. And so Meharry sums it up like this. In short, the penman of the Revolution, Dickinson wrote so much, he was so widely read, that they called him the penman of the American Revolution. He was incredibly important, worked with Jefferson in 1775 and a few other things. But in short, the penman of the Revolution took the position that the road to happiness is built on freedom, which is in turn built on property rights. And Dickinson's letters, as I was kind of leaning towards here in just a moment ago, were the most widely read documents on American liberty until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. So if you want to understand the foundational principles of the American Revolution, that is, the radical change in the viewpoints of the people from around 1760 until the shot heard round the world in April of 1775, before the fighting really broke out in the War for Independence. The real American Revolution was that radical change in the viewpoints of the people. If you want to understand their views, of course, there's a lot of reading to do. Or you could just, well, no, definitely don't want to just rely on my podcast episodes, but hopefully I whet your appetite, and then we'll provide you a bunch of links to read and learn more on your own time. But if you want to start out, the most widely read one, the most widely accepted one, were John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And they're not like a hard thing to read. Some of the quotes that I cite are really pretty straightforward, easy to read, stuff for the general public even today. And so if you want to understand that their basis of freedom and happiness and property were all tied together, you got it right there in letter 12. They were a big part, Mike writes, these letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania were a big part of what Thomas Jefferson later referred to as, quote, an expression of the American mind that helped him form the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson specifically said, hey, when I wrote this, I wasn't coming up with new ideas. I wasn't trying to come up with stuff never before thought of. I was trying to express to the world properly the American mind, how Americans understood things. And certainly Dickinson, because he was so widely read at that point, was a big part of it. And you can see him cited throughout the time. And even in the ratification debates, many of the anti-federalists were saying, oh, if we're really going to follow through on Mr. Dickinson's approach on how to live free, then we have to do this today, almost so many years later. Mike says, we can see these principles clearly expressed in the Declaration when it asserts that everybody has certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we can really break down Dickinson's explanation into three segments. So if we're talking about we cannot be happy without being free, we cannot be free without being secure in our property, and we cannot be secure in our property if without our consent others as may by right Others may, as by right, take it away. So we've got three. First of all, is freedom is the foundation of happiness. And he even had the same view a year earlier in 1766 in another address that he had written. As a foundation and security of all the rest, I wish you a true love of liberty. So the foundation for everything, our success, our prosperity, our happiness, and our security, we have to first start out with a love of liberty, because you're not going to go for liberty unless you want it, you desire it, and you love it. Mercy Otis Warren even had an interesting take on this in her great history on the American Revolution, which was written over many, many years, was finally published in the early 1800s. I believe it was called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And this was from the open address. In some editions, you'll find. She said, every domestic enjoyment depends on the unimpaired possession of civil and religious liberty. So in order to live our life happily and to enjoy our lives, we have to start out with total liberty, total freedom. And next up then is being secure in our property. That's the foundation of that freedom. Arthur Lee put it like this in 1775. He said, the right of property is the guardian of every other right. And to deprive a people of this is, in fact, to deprive them of their liberty. So again, we can't be happy without being free, but we can't have freedom unless we have security in our right to property. And Meharry puts it like this. This idea finds its roots in the English legal system that set the foundation for American law. So if we're understanding the founder's recipe, as my great friend Joe Wolverton puts it, what the founders learned from, what their influences were all about, we can look back and we can see where the precursors to this come from. And he said this goes all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215, which broadly prohibited the seizure of property without due process. It said no freeman is to be taken or imprisoned or disessed of his free tenement of his liberties or free customs, etc., etc. You can read that on your own time. It's Magna Carta is not easy text to read, especially on a live stream. But that's where it really starts out. We can see that basis for it there. And in his commentaries on the laws of England, Mike points out, William Blackstone put it like this. There is nothing which so generally strikes the imagination and engages the affections of mankind as the right of property. And John Adams also had this same point. We can find founder after founder after founder, even though you don't see property rights specifically spelled out even in the Constitution. A lot of people then assume that the founders weren't in favor of it, but they talked about this over and over and over. John Adams, for example, said property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. So we have the New England John Adams, the New Englander in Massachusetts, and Arthur Lee down in Virginia. Very different cultures and very different views on civil and religious liberty, on individual rights and freedom, and what constitute consent, for example. But they have the same understanding of the foundation of all of it, that property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. Now, it's important for you to be able to find all this information so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Not just Mike Meharry's great article, which is long, but it's got a lot of awesome info, and I'm using it as the basis for this entire episode, but all the original source documents, whether it's Mercy Otis Warren or John Dickinson or a little bit from Jefferson, Burlamaqui, etc., John Locke, that'll all be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley, the most consistent dude, most reliable ever. I love the fact that every single episode, he makes himself available to organize the blog post for every single episode. I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. You'll find a show link section for each post. You'll also find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn and X. We also live stream on some awesome platforms like we've got rumble.com and odyssey.com, and I really like the engagement we're getting over on some of these other platforms, so thank you so much. For whatever platform works best for you, we want to be there. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Gypsy and Brewster and Dennis and Sarah and a few others over on rumble.com. Thank you for being here. Let me see if I can pull up. There's John and Kirk and Jug and Howard and Too Tall. And let's see who else. There's Valden and Dixie Strong and a number of others over on YouTube, Cheriton Farmer. I appreciate you all being here. Again, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, thank you so much. But I want to get back to this because we're talking about property rights. And if property is the basis of freedom and freedom is the basis of happiness, well, are we just talking about the right to own stuff, the right to own a car or a house or something like that? No, it's actually much, much deeper because we're talking about self-ownership. And I'm going to get to that here in just a moment. Here's how Meharry kicks off this section. He said, when we hear the word property today, we generally think of land or physical things. Blackstone, for example, defined property as, quote, that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe. Now, I know some of you are thinking, hey, I own my house. I don't have sole and despotic dominion over the property here. I still got to pay a rental fee, basically. And I'm with you on that. So that doesn't mean that we really do have pure property rights in many situations today. But we're not just talking about physical property, and government invades not just our right to physical property, but our self-ownership as well. Now, first of all, James Madison wrote this really interesting essay on property in 1792 discussing this relationship. He first of all affirmed this physical definition of property by saying that a man's land or merchandise or money is called his property. But he wanted to point out that property is much more than that. He said, a man also has property in his opinions and the free communication of them. So our right to think freely, our right to speak freely, we have property in that as well. If we own ourselves, no one else can control how we think or speak. He has a property, Madison writes, of peculiar value in his religious opinions and in the profession and practice dictated by them. So having religious liberty. He has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and free choice of the objects on which to employ them. So how you want to use your physical and mental capabilities, that's up to you. No one should be dictating that to you, or you don't own yourself. In a man, Madison said, Madison said, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. So if we're really talking about true property rights, we're not necessarily just talking about the idea that we're owning stuff. And if we have to have a right to property in ourselves and our thoughts, and that is related to our pursuit of happiness, if that's the only way we can be free, then we have to think much more expansively about this. And Mike says this encapsulates the idea that property is intertwined with our other fundamental natural rights. After all, how can you have liberty in thought and action if you don't have self-ownership? And without self-ownership, possession of property can never remain secure. So you can see how it's all tied together there. And in fact, when the founders said things like James Otis Jr., who certainly took the position repeatedly, that doesn't matter what color your skin is when you're born, every man, black or white, he said, is born equally free. We are, by the laws of nature, the same humanity. But yet he was still very much willing to say, if someone else can take my property from me without my consent, he reduces me to a state of slavery. Now, I am paraphrasing how Otis put it, but this was a very common phrase from the founding generation because they were recognizing there was also a difference, of course, between chattel slavery and political slavery. This is a very charged term, and people would tell us, don't use that word today. We hear that all the time. But the founders and the old revolutionaries, whether pro or anti-slavery or involved in the trade or not, certainly took that same understanding because they could see the difference. But we see the relationship between property rights, freedom, self-ownership. And next up, we can't be secure in our property without being in a society based on consent. Without consent, there's nothing. And Mike says, given the fundamental nature of property rights, many in the founding generation believed it was unjust to take somebody's property without their consent. For example, John Jay, the future first Chief Justice of the United States back in 1774, he said, no power on earth has a right to take our property from us without our consent. So no one on earth has a right. And if they do that, they're robbing you. They are robbing you of your self-ownership. And whether we're talking your property in your physical stuff or property in yourself. Samuel Adams asked the question, what liberty can there be where property is taken away without consent? And if you answered none, you've got this one right. And here to James Otis Jr., he said, no man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. Much better than my paraphrase of this. Now, of course, there certainly can be a debate over what constitutes consent. And I think that's best left for another episode, which I did. I spent a full 35, maybe 40 minutes on this just in May, covering the John Locke, the Lockean view of consent that was really incorporated into the founding generation's views as well, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Lockean view of consent versus a century later, what we get from Lysander Spooner. And I think it's very interesting to see where there are very close similarities, very radical all along, but how it progresses further to the Spooner version as well. That'll be linked to again in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So we're talking about, again, property, consent, and freedom. These are the basis of the pursuit of happiness. And either way, we can certainly see where Jefferson carried this view forward to the Declaration. And here's how it is in that text. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. There's a lot more awesome stuff that follows that as well, but of course, that'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. And Meharry sums it up like this, and that brings us full circle back to happiness. So if we're reading that Declaration of Independence, understanding what they meant, how they viewed these things in relationship to each other, he said, it's self-evident that if the government or anybody else can take your physical property or limit the peaceful exercise of your thoughts and actions without your consent, you'll be unhappy. John Dickinson, he writes, absolutely nailed it. Happiness depends on freedom, and we can't be free if our property and ourselves and our things aren't secure from the arbitrary hands of government. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you want to help us reach and teach more people about these essential foundational principles about freedom, about property rights, about self-ownership, consent, and the like, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. We've got our 18-year anniversary. I can't believe it's actually happening later this month. And anything you can do to help us kick off the next 18 to set a foundation for real freedom in the future, today and in the future, would be greatly appreciated. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also pick out an annual, a 5-year, or a lifetime option, or you can do a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And while I'm mentioning it, I see Bonnie Blue 2A over on YouTube. And I wanted to say thank you, Bonnie, for your super chat that you gave in one of the episodes last week. I did not notice it until after the live stream is done. So cool to see you here again. Thank you so much for your support. I'm very grateful for that. But let me take a look over and see if I've got any comments or questions I can get back to right now over in the chat. A little bit back and forth. Oh, Bonnie also says, please consider being a guest on the Gary Nolan show in Columbia, Missouri. I've been on that show. I think it was when Dave Rowland substituted for it a couple of times. So that has always been very good to me. I haven't been doing interviews too much the last few months because my workload has been so heavy, but that's a really good suggestion. I have it actually on my task list to start reaching out to people to mention, hey, I'm ready to start doing some interviews again. So thank you for that recommendation. I've had a good time on that show in the past. I don't think I've actually talked with Gary, but I've been on with probably Jim Babka substituting, but definitely Dave Rowland as well. Brewster says hello from the Rumble TAC family, doing double duty both in Rumble and the YouTube chat. I appreciate you being here, whatever platform you're on. Alex says it's pronounced unalienable. I know some people debate about that. I say all kinds of things wrong, but I do my best. But I appreciate you mentioning that as well. Kirk says, we are a band of brothers and native to the soil. Yeah, we definitely have to act as a band of brothers and sisters in foundational principles of self-ownership and liberty. And again, I really appreciate you being here. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope your week is off to a good start. And I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.